In today's podcast, this podcast is a plea to you to actually take time off this summer. This is one you might want to tune in and perk up for a second. There are a lot of people out in the world that need somebody, need a voice that pleads with them to take time off, and not just time off for the sake of time off. And I'm not talking about just the typical family vacation. I hope you do that, but I also hope that you are intentional and deliberate about seeking out time. You're going to hear me talk about the intentionality around this time off, which is so important. That's right. It's June right now. This is a time of year where many people start to think about how do they take some time off in the summer. And so I want to make sure that I am reinforcing this, encouraging you, supporting this idea to give you permission and remind you of some things and truly encourage you to create time and space to step back and allow yourself to recharge.
Welcome back to The Thermostat with Jason Barger. If you're currently on a commute, a walk, or just a micro break in your day, glad you're making time to step back, to think, and to reflect on the next steps on your journey. I've never been more convinced. The best leaders and team cultures in the world are the ones that make time to step back and calibrate their thermostat. I hope today's conversation leaves you feeling grounded and inspired. Now let's dive into today's topic to engage our minds and hearts in order to authentically lead and create compelling cultures wherever we are in the world.
Hey everyone, it's Jason, and welcome back to the Thermostat Podcast, wherever you are and however you're coming to the conversation today. Thank you for being here. Glad you're here. If you're somebody who's been a part of this from the very beginning, welcome back. So glad you've been a part of this journey. We've had so many great episodes over the last few seasons. And if you are new to the podcast, welcome. Glad you are here. I really invite you to go back to listen to previous seasons of this podcast. Unbelievable conversations with thought leaders from around the world, and also micro pods to help engage your mind and heart wherever you might be on your journey. As always, my hope with this podcast is that this is a place, a space in your day, in your week, in your month, for you to step back, for you to be able to step back, to get away from things, to have some space for you to think, to reflect, to think about your own leadership and the culture you're creating with the people around you, and also to be filled with positive thoughts and encouragement and support so that you can take that next step wherever you might be along your own personal journey. I'm more convinced of this than ever, that authentic leadership and compelling cultures, team cultures, family cultures, communities, cultures of people that are coming together across teams and organizations and around the world are needed more than ever right now. And so the way that we think, the way that we act, the way that we interact, and the way that we bring our own leadership to the table is as critical as ever. So glad you're here. Glad you're tuning in. If you'll do me a favor, if you don't mind, stop what you're doing just for 1 second, if you're willing, and just rate this podcast 5 stars. I hope. Leave a review on whatever platform you're on. A nice review that hopefully tells people about the spirit of this podcast and how we're trying to develop leaders and culture and mindset and all the things that this podcast is really about. Those are the ways that the algorithms, support this work. That's how messages get shared and help amplify these messages further in the world. So if you're willing to just take a moment to rate and review the podcast, I really appreciate it. And then the other way that it spreads is by you telling people about it. So if there are colleagues on your team or in your organization or friends, people that you're connected with throughout your network, to share this podcast with them and invite them into the conversation. That's another way that it continues to spread. So thank you to everybody who thinks about not just keeping these messages within themselves, but amplifying them and spreading them to the people around you. In today's podcast, this podcast is a plea to you. I'm coming to you, pleading to you to actually take time off this summer. So this is one you might want to tune in and perk up for a second. And you may not be somebody who feels like you need somebody to tell you to take time off, but as you're going to hear in this podcast, there are a lot of people out in the world that need somebody, need a voice, but somebody that pleads with them to take time off. And not just time off for the sake of time off, but I think you're going to hear me talk about the intentionality around this time off, which is so important. So that's right. It's June right now, and so the spirit of this is a time of year where many people start to think about how do they take some time off in the summer. And so I want to make sure that I am reinforcing this, encouraging you, supporting this idea to give you permission and remind you of some things that you probably already know, but maybe you need to rehear again, and truly encourage you to create time and space to step back and allow yourself to recharge. And so, and I'm not talking about just the typical family vacation, although, you should do that too. I'm certainly going to do that as well, the typical kind of family vacation or whatever you might do. I hope you do that, but I also hope that you are intentional and deliberate about seeking out time and allowing to create some space for you to step back a little bit from your normal routines, your normal patterns of operations and behaviors, and allow your mind to recharge a little bit. And so make room to recharge those creative batteries, to allow time and space to let your mind wander, allowing space for your mind to wander. And in that wandering, it allows us some space for our thoughts to solidify. In the world that we live in that's so 24/7, 365, moving from meeting to meeting, from task to task, from kid activity to kid activity, this constant movement and grind, oftentimes our brains then are just keeping up with that, and yet some of the best thinking we do and some of the best progress we're going to stimulate is when we actually break those tendencies of just that frenetic movement and allow ourselves to step back and enter a new pattern, to allow our minds to wander a bit and allow some thoughts that may be playing in the background of our minds, almost like those on a computer, those programs that are running in the background. Allow some thoughts to solidify, and in that you will be very aware and appreciative that you had time and space that kind of recharge your mind and your heart. And so there's this myth that we're all dealing with, and you've heard me talk about this before, but this myth is the faster I run, the further I get. Again, we live in a culture where we're told, and we've come to honor this term busyness, and so we run around, and oftentimes in our work settings, and certainly if you have young kids, that you have to be, or so society tells us, all the different activities we got to have our kids involved in, and so we run into this kind of rat race of running from thing to thing to thing, and this kind of fear of missing out. And so we enter these patterns, and we begin to buy into this myth that the faster I run, the further I get. Because the reality is, the truth is, I have no doubt that there will be time in the near future, I'm not sure when, but where there will be power in congregating again. Power in bringing your whole team together, your entire company and organization together in one space for that powerful keynote speech, that discussion that has to happen as a team, an entire organization about leadership and culture and mindset. But until then, we are in a virtual world. And so if I can add value to your team, your company, or organization through a virtual keynote speech, or just helping your team and organization have the conversation that's the currency for change that you need to be having internally, I hope you'll track us down and let us know how we can be helpful at jasonvbarger.com. And we begin to buy into this myth that the faster I run, the further I get. Because the reality is, the truth is, that rest plus clarity plus action, deliberate and intentional action, means that it leads to better performance. Better performance in everything. Better performance as a friend, better performance as a spouse, better performance certainly at your job, as a parent, as a, whatever that is for you, that when we actually step back and are deliberate about rest and about clarity of what we're trying to accomplish, and then deliberate practice and action, our performance actually increases. And so that's what we're talking about on today's podcast. Is I'm pleading with you, and I'm pleading for you to take time off. I'm really encouraging you and supporting this idea of being deliberate about the time that you allow your mind to wander and help some of those thoughts in the background to solidify. Did you know this? That Americans last year left a record 768 million days of vacation on the table. This is pre-pandemic. 768 million days of vacation by Americans were just left on the table. That which equates to about nearly $66 billion of lost benefits. $66 billion of lost benefits that Americans have given, perks that are part of their compensation package, and really that places are saying this is a part of how we help you be well and stay whole and actually perform. And yet we live in a culture right now that that oftentimes what this stat is showing us is that oftentimes people are afraid to take time off. So either they're afraid to actually cash in and use that time off, which then leads to 768 million days that are just sitting there waiting for people to take, that it's already in their contract that they're supposed to take, but they don't. So either we're afraid to take time off, or again, as a society or as a culture within our teams and organizations, we've come to honor this idea, this kind of quote unquote, we're outworking the competition, which means that we can't afford to take time off. When will we actually take time off? We can't rest. I'll rest when I'm dead. All of those cliches. And so we perpetuate this culture of not taking time off. But as you study the most elite performers in the world across disciplines, artists, musicians, athletes, entrepreneurs, the very best leaders and teams and effective organizations on the planet, as you study these, actually the research is quite different than this idea that I'll just quote unquote outwork the competition and I'll rest when I'm dead. The research doesn't back up those ideas at all. It doesn't back up this idea that the most elite in the world are just running faster and faster and faster. The research and study does not back up that thought, and yet we live in this myth as if it does. So many are familiar with that the research that was done around the 10,000 hour rule. Almost every conference you go to, or a keynote speech, or again, books have been written about this. Malcolm Gladwell, who does amazing work. If you haven't read a Malcolm Gladwell book, then you need to. But so many of his different books are amazing. But in his book Outliers, he kind of made this research famous. But the research that came up with that showed us that hours and hours and hours of studying people that were elite performers, again, across many different disciplines. What the research came up with is in order to become an expert in whatever it is that you do. So a violinist, in order to become an expert, a pianist, again, to be an expert carpenter, to be an expert athlete of putting a golf ball or throwing a football or whatever, an expert who be in a particular thought leadership space, in order to become an expert doing it, the research shows that you need about 10,000 hours of deliberate practice. 10,000 hours of deliberate practice. And so what that means is these people that have become elite, that they've put in, the research clearly shows it, that they've put in the time, they've put in the work to master their craft. And what's specific about it is it isn't just 10,000 hours of showing up. It's not just once you clock in to become an auto mechanic or whatever, that as long as you're on the job, that counts as the 10,000 hours. No, it's 10,000 hours of deliberate practice, honing your craft. And as they studied this research of the most elite performers across disciplines, they found, and Malcolm Gladwell made this famous, the idea of 10,000 hours of deliberate practice. And so what people began to run with this narrative was that it was all about this 10,000 hours of deliberate practice, which again is part of the research and shows us that if you want to become a master at your craft, a master at your skill, a master at whatever it is you're doing, that it's going to require deliberate practice, 10,000 hours of deliberate practice. But unfortunately, that's where most people stopped. And even Gladwell, that's the part that he focused on of the research. But there's a whole other part of that research that people didn't talk about, and certainly we don't talk about. And it's probably because in this culture, again, we want to honor this idea that it's all about the outworking and the discipline that goes into outworking the other people. And again, that is hugely important. Again, it's a part of the research that shows elite performance is that deliberate practice. But what gets lost is that it's not only about that. As you dig deeper into the research, it actually reveals more information about world-class performance, and that it isn't just the 10,000 hours of deliberate practice, but in fact, it's 10,000 hours of deliberate practice plus 12,500 hours of deliberate rest. That's right, 12,500 hours of deliberate rest and 30,000 hours of sleep. So let's break that down a little bit, because if all we focus on is the 10,000 hours of deliberate practice, then we're missing the big picture of elite performance and the big picture of how can we be as effective as we possibly can. And so we need to make sure that we see the big picture. And so the study, and actually some of this that has played out came from the book Rest, which I also highly recommend you look into the book Rest by Alex Sujang Kim Pang. The book Rest, Why You Get More Done When You Work Less. Actually, he dives deeper into this idea of this research, and that it's not just about the deliberate practice, but it's also about deliberate practice with deliberate rest and about this deliberate sleep. And so in this study and in this then understanding of these people that have become elite or world-class in whatever they do, it cites famous leaders in our history. And it talks about their daily, monthly, and yearly practice of things like micro naps, small naps throughout every day. It talks about the importance of vacations, of getting away, of deliberate rest. It cites things like Bill Gates and what has become famous as his quote-unquote think weeks, where he takes 2 weeks every year where he just goes away by himself in a cabin with a stack of books and his notepads and things that he is needing to think about, and he just creates this space to allow his mind to wander and ideas to solidify, and he practices this kind of deliberate rest and think weeks. It talks about the power of sabbaticals, and that leaders and performers and people also in the midst of those 10,000 hours of deliberate practice, they also build in time to get away from it, to make sure that they are deliberately allowing their mind, their body, their heart to recover, to refuel, to rest. And again, the whole idea of this is that this equation is all about, it all contributes to increased performance, increased abilities. And so again, it isn't just about recovery, it's about the fact that this recovery and this rest actually helps us come out of it better than if we didn't do it. So the myth of the faster I run, the further I get, or the myth, or I'll sleep when I'm dead, or I'll outwork the competition, is actually, they're false narratives. We know it's going to require hard work and deliberate practice to become an expert at your craft. We know that. But we also know the research tells us it's going to require us to be deliberate about how we rest, refuel, recover, how we allow our minds and hearts to refuel and recharge and solidify thoughts so that when we come back, we're actually better at what we do. And so anyone who has quote unquote thinking in your job description, which I don't know who on the planet has a role where their job doesn't require them to think, then if you have that in your job description, then we ought to be thinking together, and I ought to be encouraging you to think about how you need to be thinking about how do you incorporate deliberate rest into your practice. And I would also encourage you to think about your own biorhythm. Biorhythm is something that has become really interesting to me over the last few years. And as you start to learn, there's all these different theories and concepts around the idea of biorhythm. But basically, we know of biorhythm like in the female body, the menstruation cycle that happens every 28 days. We know about these kind of rhythms within our physical bodies. But as you start to learn more about biorhythm, and whether you believe the concept fully, I mean, obviously most people see menstruation playing out, so they believe in that concept. But for those that aren't female, you may not understand that or believe in wholeheartedly that our bodies, our physical, our minds, our spirits kind of go through this cycle of energy throughout an average month. But many people that have studied this idea of biorhythm shows that we have different energy levels that kind of go up and down depending on the day, the week, the month. And also the reality is, and that's just for human beings, by the way, but animals and stuff too, but I'm talking about all human beings. Like all of us have this kind of rhythm that our bodies go through. And then the reality also is that each of us has our own individual biorhythm. And this is a little easier for people to understand or for all of us to understand. And I know, again, for me personally, this has been hugely important as I think about how I deliberately approach my days, my weeks, my month, is that all of us have a particular biorhythm. And what I mean by that is that we all have a pattern that is natural, the way we're naturally oriented. The way I would describe it for me personally is I know that I am an early riser and that my mind and energy level is best early in the morning through about midday, late morning, midday. And then my own biorhythm is I tend to, my mind gets a little heavy and a little, clunky around midday to early afternoon where my own personal biorhythm, I kind of need a rest and recovery. And then I tend to get a second wind, about mid-afternoon or late afternoon, and that carries me further. My wife, Amy, and I have different daily biorhythms of just the way that we kind of are naturally oriented. And some of this has to do with habits that you've reinforced or routines you've had over time, but also both of us that have always recognized that this has just been kind of our natural state. I remember that I've noticed this about myself from when I was a young kid, and that kind of natural biorhythm that I seem to perform at my best. And she is quite different. Early mornings is not her best time. She needs more sleep than I do. And so her time where she feels her most energy and kind of creativity and aliveness comes about mid to late morning and carries her through the afternoon. And then she tends to hit a lull about 4 in the afternoon or so. And then she gets her second wind into the evening. And she's always been more of a night owl and someone that has kind of energy late into the night. And so we have different biorhythms. And so you may be thinking about your own personal biorhythm right now. But the reality is that biorhythm is important to us because, and with leaders and teams that I coach and help support, one of the exercises that as we get into this and we begin to understand our own individual unique biorhythm is that we become more effective and productive when we're able to align our individual biorhythm with the right task, the right priority, the right type of deliberate thing with the energy level of our own in particular biorhythm. So for me personally, again, to making sure that I am strategically and deliberately planning my most creative work, whether that's recording podcasts like this, writing, speech preparation, engaging with clients, being in a room of people, all of that creativity and stuff, I'm at my best in the morning times. And so to align myself as best as possible when I can to that kind of energy produces a better, most effective result. I typically save things like returning emails, messages, office-y work, things that don't require much creativity but are things that need to get done. I save that for my midday, early afternoon time typically of when that is fitting the type of energy that I have. I personally honor and totally believe in that, and also have been blessed that my body is able to do this, but when I can, to be able to take that 20-minute just closing my eyes and allowing my mind to reboot around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I literally set a timer. I lay down, allow my eyes to close. I allow myself to reboot, and after 20 minutes, it's amazing how my mind rests. And even sometimes I actually fall asleep. Other times I literally am just allowing myself to rest, shut my eyes, allow my mind to go into, quote unquote sleep mode like a computer, to defrag my system so that when I wake up, I'm more alert and ready to get that second wind. I typically then plan in the late afternoon. That's when I begin to engage back with clients. And now I'm ready to have energy to be able to have that important one-on-one conversation, coaching call, be with clients again, that interfacing with people. I'm then ready to do that. And so everybody has their own biorhythm. And as we start to understand that, we can be more strategic about how we plan our days, our weeks, also thinking about when we strategically put the right priorities in front of us. But it also is about then being deliberate about our sleep, about when we take time off to vacation and allow ourselves to reboot. And then for me personally, I also get strategic about my own sabbaticals, my own think weeks, those times when I need to get away, break tendencies, and allow my mind to wander and to let those ideas solidify. The Wallace, if you are familiar with the Wallace 4-stage of the creative process that was created back in 1926, it's been a famous model, but it talks about the creative process, that there's stages to the creative process. The first stage is preparation, where we need to prepare ourselves to even whatever that thought is or the thing we're working on in order to be creative. We need to prepare ourselves. And then there's the second stage of incubation, where the word I bring to it, or I talk about things need to marinate. And so oftentimes in my creative process, I have a lot of ideas or things that I just need time to allow them to incubate, to marinate, to percolate, to kind of ruminate in the background. And then the third stage is illumination. And that's when from that incubation, now all of a sudden the idea solidifies, becomes more clear. And then we can actualize the idea. We can start to bring, so that book you're trying to write, that project you're working on where you've been trying to figure out what the solution is, that conversation you need to have with somebody, you've been trying to think about what's the right way to approach it. Then all of a sudden you have that stage of illumination, and then you understand what the next action is. And then the fourth stage of the creative process is verification, which means we got to go try it out. We got to go, we've got to get a draft out of whatever you're working on. You got to kick the tires. You got to go have the conversation and with somebody and try out, am I thinking about this in the right way? And so preparation, incubation, illumination, and verification. The most creative thinkers, teams, and organizations on the planet, they allow time and space to make sure that these 4 stages are being lived and deliberately practiced. they realize that this is a part of world-class performance. Deliberate rest and sleep is not just an add-on. It's not just an extra to the 10,000 hours of, deliberate practice. It's actually essential to overall performance. And so in that book that I referenced, Rest, Why You Get More Done When You Work Less, I love this quote. It says, as we move into a world and economy that seems to defy the constraints of geography and time, that operates globally and 24/7, we feel the need or pressure to work continuously, to ignore our body clocks and push on, event after event when our bodies are pleading to rest. But this is a huge mistake. Our world-class performance, that's the end of the quote, but our world-class performance, or however you rate or aim your own personal performance, is directly tied to our ability or our inability to deliberately practice plus deliberately rest in order to think, grow, and evolve our lives and our work, and to sleep. That's combination of things is where our best performance lives. And the culture for how we approach our work, how we approach our lives, how we coach, how we teach, how we develop ourselves and the people around us, all of this matters. Leaders, teams, and organizations, in my opinion, as you've been hearing me say over the last year and a half with all that's been happening in the world, leaders, teams, and organizations are already playing, and into the future will play an even bigger role in helping us as individuals learn better habits for the way that we lead ourselves, the culture that we create with other people, and how we have those conversations that are the currency for change that help us model and align people that might be different than us, and how we get ourselves looking in the same direction. And so does how we rest. Not just how we deliberately practice together, but how we deliberately rest together. And so I believe it is our leaders, our teams, our places of employment that are going to lead the way in helping us raise the bar on our own leadership, our own actions in the world, and help us to be co-creators and participants in creating the culture that we want to be a part of. The very best in the world are doing that. So, as always, I want to leave you with some questions to ponder for this day or this week in your life. When will you intentionally, deliberately, and strategically rest in the coming months? When will you intentionally, deliberately, and strategically rest in the coming months? When and how will you give your mind and heart space to wander and rejuvenate? When and how will you give your mind and heart space to wander and rejuvenate? And I encourage you to rest, to laugh, to enjoy, to be with the people you love, to have fun, to find time and space this summer to do all of those things, to not just deliberately practice, because again, that's a part of everything to be elite, but also to deliberately rest, because that is also what it means to practice and be an elite performer. And trust me, your performance will be better because of it. Remember, the best leaders, teams, and cultures on the planet are stimulating progress every day, every week, every month by the way they recalibrate their thermostat so that they can set the temperature that they want intentionally, proactively on the days ahead together.
Thank you for listening to today's podcast, and I hope the messages and questions stimulate positive change along your path. As always, if these messages resonate with you and add value to your life, I hope you'll help amplify them throughout the world. Please rate, comment, and share on whatever podcast or social media platform you're using. And share this podcast with the people in your life or work who should be part of these conversations. That way, this spirit does, in fact, spread. If these messages or developing leaders and culture would be helpful to your organization, or you have a question or comment about this podcast, please contact us at jasonvbarger.com. And remember, we all are ambassadors for the culture we want to create in our life and work, We have to own the vision we want to be a part of. The future of leadership is you, is me, is us. Be a thermostat.